the coffee mug hit the marble floor before anyone understood what was happening. Gemma Hartley's chair rolled backward on its own as her body gave way. Arms limp, head dropping, the stack of audit binders she'd been holding fanning out across the accounting floor like a deck of fallen cards. A junior clerk screamed. Another lunged for a phone. 3 people dropped to their knees beside her at once, none of them certain what to do. She'd been at her desk for 39 hours straight. "Call an ambulance!" The night supervisor's voice cracked as he pressed 2 fingers to her wrist. "Now, don't ask, just call." The private elevator at the end of the hallway opened 40 seconds later. Kieran Montague stepped out without hurry. He wore no jacket. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows, a pen still tucked behind one ear, as if he'd simply risen from his own desk to walk down 1 floor. His eyes moved across the room once, reading everything in a single sweep, the way men who'd survived long careers in dangerous cities learned to do. Then they stopped on Gemma. "She needs paramedics," the supervisor said quickly. "Sir, I already—" "Cancel them." Kieran's voice was level. "Drive her. My car." "Sir, hospital protocol requires." "She collapses in my building. She rides in my car." He was already crossing the room. "Get the door." No one argued. He lifted her from the floor with both arms, the kind of careful, deliberate movement that left no room for comment. The accounting staff stood frozen around their desks, watching Chicago's most feared crime lord carry their plus-size accountant down the hallway as though that were the only reasonable thing to do. None of them breathed until the elevator doors closed behind him. The emergency room at Mercy General had never processed a patient quite like this. 3 black SUVs arrived in quiet formation. Security moved into position along the corridor without drawing attention. The attending physician at the intake desk recognized the man carrying the unconscious woman through the doors and made exactly 1 phone call before the trauma team materialized. "She's in acute exhaustion." The physician spoke fast, snapping on gloves, blood pressures crashing, heart rate erratic. "We need fluids and cardiac monitoring immediately." Kieran stood back from the gurney. He didn't pace. He didn't make phone calls. He stood with his hands in his pockets and watched every move the medical team made with the expression of a man cataloging information he'd decide what to do with later. Gemma's fingers curled slightly against the bed rail as they transferred her. Even unconscious, her grip was trying to hold on to something. He noticed that. An hour later, the physician found him exactly where he'd left him. "Mr. Montague." Kieran looked up. "Tell me." "She'll recover." The doctor paused. "But I want you to understand how close we're talking about." Another 6, maybe 8 hours at the level of physical and cognitive stress her body has been under. He stopped himself, chose the next words carefully. She might not have made it to morning. The hallway was very quiet. Kieran said nothing for a long moment. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had sat across negotiating tables from men who wanted to kill him and ordered coffee. He had received news of betrayals, financial losses, federal inquiries, and the deaths of people he respected without letting his expression change. The discipline had taken most of his adult life to build, and it had never once broken. It bent now, just slightly, just enough that his jaw tightened and he looked down at the floor. "Who signed off on her schedule?" "I'm sorry." "Her work schedule." He raised his eyes again. "Who approved it?" The physician blinked. "That's not a medical question." "No," Kieran agreed, "it isn't." He made 2 phone calls from the hallway. The first was to his executive assistant, "Clear tomorrow, and the day after." A brief silence on the other end. "The investor call?" He waited. "Move it." Another pause. "The commissioner's dinner," he considered for half a second. "Apologize. Send wine. Move it." The second was to his head of hotel operations, a sharp-edged man named Sato, who had worked for the Montague Group for 11 years. and had never once heard his employer sound the way he sounded at that moment. I want 6 months of scheduling data on my desk by 8 a.m. Every hour Gemma Hartley logged, every request she received, every substitution, every extension, every approval. Kieran's voice was composed, too composed, the kind of calm that came from someone deciding not to waste emotion on a phone call when there was a room to stand in. And I want to know who kept approving a schedule no human being should have been running on. Sato swallowed. Yes, sir. One more thing. Sir. Find out why she thought collapsing was easier than saying no. The line went silent because there was no answer for that. Morning shifted through the hospital blinds in thin, pale lines. Gemma's color had returned. The readings on the monitors had steadied through the night. Kieran was still there. He'd accepted a chair sometime around 3 a.m., at the quiet insistence of a nurse, who seemed to sense that arguing would be pointless and chose to compromise instead. His jacket was folded over the arm of a second chair. His shirt sleeves were still rolled. The cup of coffee someone had brought him sat cold and untouched on the bedside table, an irony that would not become clear to him until later. He was reading through an overnight report on his phone when he felt the smallest possible movement. Her fingers shifted. The nurse appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Montague, she's coming around." He stood without hurrying, which was its own kind of urgency. Gemma's eyes opened slowly, adjusted to the light, found the ceiling. She frowned faintly, the way people do when the body wakes before the memory catches up. She felt the IV. She felt the stiff blanket. She felt the low, rhythmic beep of something monitoring her heart. Then, the way hands reach for familiar things in the dark, hers moved sideways across the bed rail. Warm fingers met hers. She didn't open her eyes again right away. She just held on, the grip loose but definite, the way a child holds something they don't want to lose. The warmth was solid, present. It didn't pull away. When she finally turned her head, she saw him. Gemma stared at Kieran Montague for 3 full seconds. Then she looked down at their joined hands. A deep flush moved up her throat and into her face. "Mr. Mont." She tried to sit up. The room tilted badly. "I'm so sorry, I didn't realize." "Don't." His voice was quiet. One hand steadied her shoulder before she could fall sideways. Slow. She went still, breathed. "The audit files. I need to finish the—" "Gemma." She stopped. He waited until she was actually looking at him. "The first thing you said when you opened your eyes was an apology." His tone carried no judgment, only an observation with the weight of a verdict. The second was about work. She had no answer. "Neither of those," he said, "was asking how you got here." The room settled around them. Outside in the corridor, someone spoke quietly to someone else. A cart rolled past. In here, nothing moved. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said finally. "You didn't cause trouble. You worked until your heart nearly gave out." The distinction in his voice was clean and deliberate. "That is not the same thing." Gemma looked away. She had a habit of that, redirecting her eyes when something landed too directly, a reflex developed in years of making herself unobtrusive. "I was behind on the audit prep," she said quietly. "There was no one else who could. We'll talk about that later." He sat back down. "Right now you're going to drink water, and then you're going to rest, and that is the entirety of your job today." She looked at him then, surprised by the matter-of-fact authority of it, the same tone she imagined he used when closing deals that couldn't be negotiated. Almost against her will, she laughed. It came out soft and tired and entirely genuine. "You're giving me instructions." He looked at her with something that might, from a certain angle, have been close to fond. "I give everyone instructions. It's one of the things I'm very good at." The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Montague Grand had a view of Lake Michigan on a clear day. On this morning it held Sato, 2 senior scheduling supervisors, Kieran's legal counsel, and a table covered in printed spreadsheets. Kieran stood at the head of it. He hadn't slept. It didn't show, or rather, it showed only in the quality of his attention, which was sharper than usual in a way that made everyone in the room careful about how they breathed. "Walk me through this." He touched one of the sheets. 312 overtime hours in 6 months. Sato cleared his throat. Technically, the hours were self-authorized. She never filed a formal overtime request. The system doesn't flag voluntary extension. "Explain to me," Kieran said, without raising his voice, "why my senior accountant was voluntarily working until her body failed." Silence. A scheduling supervisor named Angie, who had been with the hotel for 4 years, folded her hands on the table. "Mr. Montague, if I can speak plainly." He looked at her. "Please." Gemma didn't stay late because she had to. She stayed because when someone else had a problem, she fixed it, quietly, without making it into anything. Angie paused. "In February, our payroll coordinator had a family emergency, 3-week bereavement. Gemma absorbed the entire function, without asking for acknowledgement. In April, 2 members of the audit prep team left suddenly, and she reabsorbed their workloads, without flagging it as a capacity issue because she knew the department was over budget, and she didn't want to add to it. Angie looked down at the table. She just dealt with things. That was what she did. A guest services manager spoke next, carefully. There was a tray of protein bars that appeared in the break room every Monday morning for about 8 months. Nobody knew who left them. She paused. "I found out last month it was Gemma. She'd noticed the overnight staff never had time to reach the cafeteria before it closed." Legal counsel shifted slightly. Kieran was very still. Sato spoke again, quietly. "The IT help desk manager, his son had emergency surgery in March. Gemma absorbed his full accounts reconciliation while he was out and told him she'd cleared it with you directly." Sato stopped. She hadn't, but he was terrified about losing his position, and she wanted him to be able to stay with his family. "What did she say to him?" Kieran asked. Sato glanced at his notes. "According to him, you'd have done the same for anyone. You just don't have to this time." The room fell quiet the way rooms fall quiet when something becomes true in front of an audience. Kieran picked up the next file. He read for a long time without speaking. Neurology consults, occupational therapy, prescription costs, mobility equipment. A name repeated throughout, Patricia Hartley. Relationship, mother. Every additional hour Gemma had worked, every extended shift and covered weekend, had funded that file. There were no vacations recorded in 6 years, no discretionary purchases, only invoices from hospitals and the quiet arithmetic of someone deciding that another person's recovery mattered more than her own rest. He turned one more page, found a resignation letter dated 14 months ago, unsigned. Clipped to it was a single sheet flagged by HR security, a personal email forwarded to a work address by mistake, never meant for anyone else's eyes. He read it twice. "You're the smartest woman I know, and you work yourself into the ground for people who will never notice. That's not loyalty, Gemma. That's self-erasure. And I can't watch it anymore. You've made yourself invisible on purpose, and I used to think that was modesty. I don't anymore. You don't believe you deserve to take up space, and I can't love someone out of that." He set the paper down. He thought about the Monday protein bars no one had claimed. He thought about the IT manager's son's surgery. He thought about 312 unclaimed overtime hours, quietly funding someone's mother through rehabilitation. He thought about a woman who had made herself invisible for so long, she had nearly disappeared entirely. For the first time in years, Kieran Montague felt something he didn't have a clean word for. Not sentiment, not pity. Something closer to recognition. The particular clarity that arrives when you suddenly understand that someone you'd placed at the periphery had been, all along, the most essential thing in the room. He rose from his chair. I want a full review of CFO Bradford Yates's management practices, specifically as they relate to departmental staffing decisions and authorization gaps over the past 2 years. He moved toward the window, toward the lake, where morning light was hitting the water in long silver lines. Then, quietly, not to the room, but to something outside it, she won't carry this alone again. The Montague Group's winter gala was held 6 weeks later in the grand ballroom of the hotel Gemma had worked in for 5 years without ever attending as a guest. She almost didn't come. It was Kieran's mother, Isadora Montague, a silver-haired woman with steel posture and absolutely no patience for unnecessary hesitation, who appeared at her apartment door 2 days before the event and handed her an ivory envelope. "You've spent 5 years making that building run," Isadora said, without warm-up or small talk, in the way of women who'd lived long enough to stop wasting words. "You'll come to the party this year, that's settled." Gemma wore a deep burgundy dress. Floor-length, simply cut, beautifully fitted. It was not a designer label. It was the nicest thing she owned, bought 3 years ago for a friend's wedding and worn twice since. She stood near the ballroom's edge, holding a glass of sparkling water, cataloguing exits the way accountants catalogue columns, by habit, by the quiet certainty that knowing where the door was had always been better than being surprised. She was watching a floral arrangement drip water onto a tablecloth and mentally calculating whether it would stain before anyone noticed when she heard her name behind her. "Miss Hartley." Bradford Yates appeared at her shoulder. He was 51, impeccably dressed, and had spent the past 3 weeks watching his departmental access levels quietly revoked one by one as Kieran's internal review advanced. He was not in a gracious mood. His face was arranged in the specific expression of a man who'd decided to conduct business, while pretending it was conversation. "I heard you've recovered fully. Remarkable." "Thank you." She turned slightly. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "I was." He smiled without warmth. "Tell me something. The audit work you were completing when you had your episode." He tilted his head. "There were a number of informal petty cash disbursements I've been looking into. Undocumented, outside standard approval channels." He watched her face. "Did you want to explain those?" The room felt warmer. "I authorized those personally," she said, even tone, steady hands. "You authorized?" He raised both eyebrows. "An accountant making unilateral disbursements." He let it sit in the air between them. "Some might call that misappropriation." "Some might," Gemma said quietly, "if they didn't look at what the funds were disbursed for." "And what were they for?" She met his eyes. A maintenance worker whose daughter needed a hearing aid and didn't have insurance coverage. A cocktail server whose apartment flooded and had nowhere to go for 2 weeks. A prep cook who was sending money home after his father's stroke and couldn't make rent 1 month. She paused. The total across 14 months was slightly under $9,000. Every dollar is documented. I kept the records. Bradford studied her. "That's not your decision to make." "You're right," she said. "It should have been made by someone above me. But no one was making it." Something behind his eyes shifted. The pretense of civility was gone now. "You know what I think, Miss Hartley? I think you've convinced yourself you're essential. That because no one seemed to notice, no one was watching." He leaned slightly. "People always notice. They just don't always say so." He moved closer. Not quite aggressive, but with the specific calculated pressure of someone reminding another person exactly how little space they were entitled to occupy. His shoulder made contact with hers. Gemma's heel caught on the edge of a decorative platform riser she hadn't noticed behind her. She lost her balance. And then she didn't fall. An arm caught her at the waist. Firm, immediate, absolutely certain. A hand steadied her elbow with a precision that suggested someone who had moved through this room and arrived at this exact spot faster than the room had registered. She looked up. Kieran. He was looking only at her, steady. She breathed. Yes. He kept his arm where it was for exactly 1 more second, just long enough for her to be certain of her footing. And then he turned. The warmth left his face as though it had never been there. The ballroom had gone very quiet in the way of rooms that understand something significant is unfolding. Bradford. Kieran's voice carried to every corner without effort. You believe Ms. Hartley misappropriated funds. Bradford recalibrated rapidly. I was simply raising a procedural question about $9,000. Kieran's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Across 14 months, 14 disbursements, every one of them documented, every recipient a member of our staff in a genuine hardship situation. He paused. My accountant found a gap in the company's emergency welfare provisions and filled it with her own initiative and her own time. And you would like to call that misappropriation? Bradford opened his mouth. Don't. The word was quiet, final. Kieran turned to the room, not performing, not theatrically sweeping his gaze, simply acknowledging that he knew they were there. $9,000 is what Gemma Hartley spent on this staff in her own capacity, out of accounts she managed personally, because no formal system existed to do what she was already doing. The same year, she worked 312 hours of unclaimed overtime. She covered 3 staffing gaps without flagging them as critical. She funded her own mother's physical therapy while doing all of this. He paused, not for effect, but to be certain the next part landed clearly. She nearly died at her desk 6 weeks ago, and none of us noticed she was drowning until she stopped moving. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Bradford Yates's position with the Montague Group ended this afternoon, Kieran said. The paperwork was completed at 4 o'clock. That's not a decision made tonight. It was made 3 weeks ago, when my review team documented a pattern of deliberate understaffing and ignored welfare flags going back 2 years in his department. He turned back to Gemma then. The entire room's attention came with him. She was looking at him with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not quite surprise, not quite gratitude, something quieter and more fundamental than either. The look of someone who had spent a very long time braced to absorb a blow that turned out not to be coming. Kieran extended his hand. Not as an employer, not as a chairman, simply as a man who had decided that the space beside him was where she belonged. Gemma looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She placed her hand in his. The applause started slowly. Then, with the full-throated sincerity of people who had watched someone they cared about finally be seen, it filled the room. Gemma didn't cry. She'd made that quiet decision somewhere around the 2nd hour in the hospital, when she'd understood that the tears, if she let them start, would carry 6 years of careful invisibility with them, and she wasn't certain she could stop. But she felt them. Somewhere behind her sternum, in the place where she kept the things she didn't let out. Isadora Montague, watching from across the ballroom, pressed 2 fingers briefly to her lips. She had wondered for years whether her emotionally exact, professionally unreachable son was capable of choosing someone with his whole chest rather than cataloguing the decision the way he catalogued everything else. Now she had her answer. He hadn't chosen. He'd already decided. He'd simply been the last one in the building to know it. The internal changes moved quickly after that. Bradford's exit had opened a cavity in the company's oversight structure, and Kieran filled it differently than anyone had expected. He didn't hire a replacement CFO. He convened a staff welfare task force, mandatory, every department head. The agenda was a single page. What had gone wrong, what would be different, and who would be responsible for making sure it stayed different. Overtime caps, a formal emergency assistance fund, properly capitalized this time, with a clear application process and a designated officer to manage it. Anonymous reporting lines. Manager evaluations now included a staff well-being metric, weighted at 30%. One executive privately said it was the most comprehensive personnel restructuring he'd seen outside a corporate crisis. Another pointed out, more quietly, that it hadn't come from a consultant or a board directive. It had come from a chairman who'd spent an entire night in a hospital hallway. No one put that in the official documentation. Everyone understood it. The formal announcement came at the next all-staff meeting. Gemma Hartley had been appointed Director of Employee Welfare, a newly created position reporting directly to the chairman's office. There was exactly one person who objected, and that person was Gemma. She found Kieran in his office the morning after the announcement, still holding the letter, her voice carrying the specific quality of someone who has rehearsed a reasonable objection and knows it's about to be overruled. "I'm an accountant," she said. He looked up from his desk. "I know. I have no formal credentials in this area. There are qualified people who could." "There are qualified people," he agreed. "None of them have lived the experience. None of them know what it looks like from the inside when a person decides collapsing is easier than asking for help." He held her gaze. "You do. That's not a qualification I can hire for." Gemma looked down at the letter, then at him. "You're doing it again." "What?" "Giving instructions as though they're not negotiable." He almost smiled. "They're not." She exhaled, and then, despite herself, she laughed. The quiet, real laugh he'd first heard in a hospital room, the one that sounded like something she'd been keeping for a long time. "Fine," she said, "but I want full budget authority." He leaned back in his chair. 40%. 60. He studied her for a moment. "You're negotiating with me. You said I was good at my job." A beat. "Then 55, and you report directly to me, not through the operations chain." Gemma tilted her head. Something in her expression, some tightness around the eyes that had been there every time he'd looked at her over the past year, was gone. Deal. 3 months after that, on an evening in late March, the lake was doing its glittering thing in the dying light, and Gemma was standing at the window of the 41st floor with a folder she didn't need. Because the real reason she'd stayed past 6 was that she hadn't wanted to go home yet, and she wasn't ready to examine why. Kieran appeared in the doorway behind her. She didn't turn around. "Long day," he said. "Average." She watched a boat move across the water below. "Your mother called me this afternoon." He came to stand beside her, not close enough to crowd, just close enough. "What did she say?" "She asked whether I'd decided yet." He was quiet. "I told her I didn't know what she was referring to." And she said. Gemma finally turned. In the fading light, the expression on her face was unguarded, in a way she usually wasn't. She laughed, and told me that I did. Kieran looked at her steadily. He had the quality she'd noticed in him from the beginning, the ability to be entirely still while the room moved around him. It had unsettled her once. Now it felt, somehow, like ground. "She's right," he said simply. Gemma looked away again, down at the folder, the lake, anywhere. "I spent a long time not taking up space," she said finally. Her voice was even, carefully so. "Making myself smaller, easier, less." She paused. "I got very good at it." "I know. And you want me to believe that someone like you—" She stopped, started again. "Men like you don't notice people like me, not the way you're." Another stop. Kieran stepped closer, one step, unhurried. "I noticed you," he said. "The first week you worked in this building. You were running numbers in a meeting where everyone else was watching me, and you were the only person in the room looking at the actual data." He paused. You were also the only person who wrote a correction in the margin of a report I'd already signed off on and left it on my desk without a note explaining who'd done it. She blinked. That was 4 years ago. I know when it was. Gemma was quiet for a long moment. The lake stretched outward below them, going dark at the edges. The email, she said finally, very quietly, from my ex. HR flagged it by mistake. He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He wasn't wrong about everything, she said. I did make myself invisible. I thought, she pressed her lips together. I thought if I was useful enough, that would be enough. That being needed was the same as being wanted. It isn't, Kieran said. No, she looked at him. I know that now. He reached out slowly, giving her every fraction of a second to step back. His hand rested against the side of her face, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. You left protein bars in the break room for 8 months, he said quietly. You lied to a frightened man about having authorization, so he could sit with his son through surgery. You documented every dollar of $9,000, because somewhere in the back of your mind you knew someone might one day question whether you had the right. He paused. You reminded a man who runs a criminal empire to eat lunch. For 5 years, without ever being asked. She laughed, short and startled. How did you? The notes were eventually forwarded to me. My assistant found them in a miscellaneous intake file. Something in his expression did something quiet and certain. I started eating lunch. I didn't know why. I do now. Gemma looked at him. The man who had cancelled 3 days of meetings for someone else's hospital stay. Who had carried her himself because she had collapsed in his building. Who had spent weeks dismantling a system that had nearly killed her, not because it made business sense, but because she had nearly died inside it, and he intended that to never be possible again. She had spent 5 years watching him from the perimeter, had believed, with the particular thoroughness of someone who'd learned to preempt their own disappointment, that the perimeter was exactly where she was supposed to stay. Slowly, she lifted her hand and placed it flat against his chest. He covered it with his own. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Below them, Chicago spread outward in every direction, a city that moved fast, forgot quickly, and rarely paused long enough to notice the person quietly holding the whole operation together from a desk on the 41st floor. Tonight, for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, Gemma Hartley was not watching it from the edge. She was standing at the center of it, and she was not standing alone.